So we will study the firm's payout policy under asymmetric information. And so the firm's payout policy is non-trivial because the payout that you give to your shareholders is at the discretion of the firm, which is in contrast to the payout to debt holders, which is purely contractual. It's whatever the debt contract specifies. And why under asymmetric information? Well, because we know that in a simple Modigliani-Miller world without any frictions, payout policy is irrelevant. And this is why we have a blank slide here. Whatever you do with the firm's funds, whether you repay them to shareholders or not, is neither going to create nor destroy value. Okay, but in a world with asymmetric information, now the payout policy of the firm is potentially relevant. And in particular, it can fulfill a signaling purpose. It can convey some information about the firm type. This is a dividend signaling theory that we are going to study in this lecture. Okay, so to understand it, we are first going to understand what it means to have a signaling equilibrium. So in a signaling game, the difference with a game of adverse selection is that now the informed party, whom we're going to refer to as the principal, moves first by taking an action. And so this is referred to as a signaling game because this action can potentially reveal something about the type of the principal. So let's take an example. Let's say the principal is a firm and it's informed about its type. So the firm knows its own type. And the firm can take two actions to keep things simple. So pay a high dividend or pay low dividend or no dividend. And let's suppose that good firms pay high dividends, whereas bad firms pay low dividends. So in this case, if firms indeed act according to these principles, even though you do not observe the type of the firm, whether it is good or bad, if you observe the action taken by the firm, paying a high or low dividend, you can infer its type. In this case, the action is fully revealing. And so this would be what we refer to as a separating equilibrium, because different types of principle, so the principles are the informed party, the party with information that is moving first by taking an action. In separating equilibria, each type of principle takes a different action, and so the action fully reveals the type of the principle. There can also be pooling equilibria, where all types of principle take the same action. This is what we studied with the pecking order theory. All firms would issue the same type of securities. We can also have semi-separating equilibria, in which the action by the principal is informative, but is not fully informative. And so, for example, you would have three types of principles, and two types of principles are going to take one action, and the third type is going to take the other action. So what is an equilibrium in a signaling game? So we often use the concept of a perfect Bayesian equilibrium, which is defined as follows. So it's defined as a strategy for each type of principle that's going to specify the action taken by this principle, and updated beliefs for the agent. So the agent observes the action taken by the informed principle and is going to update its beliefs about the type of the principle. That must satisfy three conditions. The first one is an optimality condition. So given the beliefs and beliefs updating by the agent, a principle of a given type, theta, must optimally indeed take the postulated action A. So given the beliefs of the agent, the principle takes the optimal action. The second condition is that after observing the principle's action, the agent is going to update his beliefs rationally. And what does it mean to update beliefs rationally? It means that we're going to use Bayesian updating. And so this is Bayes' rules. And this is a probability that the principal has type theta, given that the principal took action A. Okay, so in the very simple example here, this is very straightforward because the probability that the, let's say, theta is equal to a good firm, given that the action taken was paying a high dividend, would be equal to 1. Likewise, probability that the firm is good, conditional on a low dividend, will be equal to 0. Okay, it's very straightforward, but sometimes signaling games are a bit more complex. And so we use this formula for belief updating. So this is a formula for conditional probability. And now we're going to rewrite it simply by writing the probability of observing action A as the sum over all principal types of the probability of observing action A conditional on a principal type theta multiplied by the probability that the principal has type theta. Okay, so Bayesian updating, that is the second condition for equilibrium. And the third is very model specific. There can be additional conditions depending on the model. For example, prices are determined on a competitive market, or some economic agent must break even, and so on. So how do we solve a signaling game? So the first step is that you're going to postulate some prior beliefs from the agent about the principal's type. As for example, the agent is going to believe that half of the firms are good, half of the firms are bad. So that's pretty straightforward. That can just be based on the frequency of good and bad firms in the economy. What is less straightforward, that you also postulate the agent's beliefs about the action taken by each type of principal. So here the agent, for example, will postulate that good firms pay a high dividend, bad firms do not. But the agent could also have different beliefs. And this introduces a complication in signaling games, because depending on the beliefs that you postulate regarding what the agent thinks about the action taken by each type of principal, you could end up with multiple equilibrium. Okay, but after this, you determine what is the optimal action for each type of principal given the agent's beliefs. This is usually quite straightforward. And finally, you verify that this is an equilibrium. So remember, we have two equilibrium conditions. This action taken must indeed be optimal for the principal, and the agent must have the correct belief and must correctly update his beliefs. If there are multiple equilibria, there's some refinement criteria. There's a Chow and Krebs intuitive criterion that's going to rule out some suboptimal actions from the principal's perspective. And then there's Maskin and Tyrrell, who proposes that the informed principal is going to offer a contract to the agent. Okay, so now let's study a model of dividend signaling. And in this model, the firm type is going to be unknown, which is going to introduce a game for information revelation via an action taken by the firm in the form of a dividend announcement and dividend payment. Okay, so what is the model? So at time 0, so there's going to be 3 dates: time 0, time 1, and time 2. At time 0, all firms, all types of firms, have cash R greater than 0. And they also have assets in place which are worth A, but that require a reinvestment of I1 at time 1. Okay, and we're going to assume that I1 is less than the amount of cash that the firm has, and the reinvestment is less than the asset value. If you don't reinvest I1, if you don't pay this cost, these assets need to be liquidated. Okay, and the liquidation value of assets in place, well, it's less than what they are worth, and so it would only be a lambda, which is less than 1 times A. Okay, discount rate equals to 0, so even though there's different periods, there's no time discounting. We keep things simple. Now, so there's a different firm type. There's a proportion 1/2 of good firms and a proportion 1/2 of bad firms. They are indistinguishable by outside investors. Okay, again, this is what we need for firm actions to be potentially revealing. They're going to reveal some information that investors do not have. Firms can invest in a new project, and this requires a cost of I0 at time 0. The revenues from this investment project are realized later, and they're going to depend on the firm type. So a firm type is going to have access to better projects that are going to generate higher future revenues as opposed to a bad firm. For a good firm, the revenues would be equal to R1S at time 1 if it invests in a project, and R2S at time 2. For a bad firm, however, the revenues would be only R1F at time 1 and R2F at time 2. What do we assume about these revenues? Well, we assume that the investment project is a positive NPV for a good firm, meaning the sum of future revenues is greater than the investment cost. I remember that there's no discounting here. Whereas for a bad firm, it's the opposite. So the sum of future revenues is less than the investment cost. We're also going to assume that the revenues at time 2 for a good firm are greater than the investment cost. To make things interesting, we're going to assume that external funding is necessary at time 0. So the investment cost, I0, is greater than the cash that the firm has. So the firm is going to need to raise external funding. Also, internal revenues generated by the firm, regardless of its type, if it's good or bad, are going to be insufficient to meet the reinvestment need at time 1. Okay, so you cannot just rely on the revenues from the investment to pay the cost I1 at time 1. And finally, liquidation as a negative net present value. So you should try to avoid it if possible, in the sense that the value of the assets in place minus the reinvestment cost is greater than the liquidation value of the firm's assets. So if possible, you should try to avoid liquidating these assets. Let's try to summarize all the cash in place and the cash flows in these tables. Starting with a good type of firm. So there's 3 days. So what does a firm has? It has cash R, assets in place worth A. For these assets in place, there's going to be a reinvestment cost at time 1. The firm also has a new investment that's going to involve a cost I0 at time 0. And it's going to produce these future revenues at time 1 and 2. And finally, it's going to need to raise some funding. So for now, we're going to say that it's debt, which is going to be, involve a cash transfer of I0, and it's going to meet the cost of the new investment, and which will need to be reimbursed at time 2. For now, we're just going to assume that the reimbursement is also equal to I0. For a bad type of firm, everything is similar, except that the revenues produced at time 1 and time 2 will be different if the firm invests in this investment project. Okay, so now what happens to the firm cash at time 1 if the firm were to pay a dividend at time 0? So would the firm have enough cash at time 1? And let's consider at first a good firm type, meaning that the revenues it will get at time 1 will be equal to this. So what is the cash is going to have at time 1? So the cost of the new investment is met by debt issuance at time 0. So there's no net cash flow here. So what's going to be the cash of the firm? Well, there's a cash in hand, which is R. At time 1, there's going to be this expense, which is reflected here, and these revenues, which are reflected there. Okay. But so this whole thing so far is positive because of the assumption that we made, meaning that the firm can pay a dividend. And here I constructed the amount of the dividend, so in blue, exactly in such a way that the firm will have 0 net cash at time 1 if it pays a dividend at time 0, which is worth this much. No. So why would a good firm do that? Because then if a bad firm were trying to do the same, so we're trying to pay the same dividend as a good firm, again in blue, this bad firm will run out of cash at time 1, right? So if you pay this same dividend at time 0, your cash at time 1, so you would still have cash in hand R, you would still have the reinvestment cost I1, but now your revenues, instead of being R1S, will be R1F. Okay, and R1F is less than R1S, and so this would be less than 0. Okay, so based on that, so consider the following set of strategies. So when we're trying to solve for a signaling equilibrium, we need to postulate some strategies and some beliefs, and then verify that we have optimality and that the beliefs are verified in equilibrium. So at time 0, a good firm is going to pay this dividend. So this is exactly what we had on the previous slide. So it pays a dividend worth this much. It's raising external funding worth I0. This is to pay for the cost of the new investment. And it's going to invest in a project. Why is that? Well, the project has positive NPV from the perspective of a good firm. At time 0 now, a bad firm will not pay any dividend, does not raise any external funding, does not invest. From the perspective of a bad firm, the project has a negative NPV. Okay. Now let's consider the following set of beliefs. So outside investors will believe, so they observe the action taken by the firm, they observe the dividend payment at time 0. And they believe that a firm that pays a dividend worth this much, in blue here, is a good firm. Same thing as that. They believe that a firm that pays a dividend which is less than this, or no dividend at all, is a bad firm. Okay, so it kind of makes sense, but we still need to verify that this is an equilibrium. So we need to check 2 things. First of all, so conditional on the outside investors' belief. So we take beliefs as given. We have to verify that firms are behaving optimally so that they will indeed pursue these strategies. Second, we need to verify that investors' beliefs will be verified in equilibrium so that they have correct beliefs. Okay, so let's start with a good firm. And let's verify that what it is doing is indeed optimal. So it is paying a dividend worth this much. So it's using its cash holdings to pay a dividend, but it still needs to retain this amount in cash to meet the reinvestment need at time 1. Okay, so this is retained cash, and this is the amount of the dividend payment. So you don't pay all your cash holdings, you still retain some cash. It's going to issue debt with a face value of D equal to I0. So the debt repayment is equal to whatever the debt holders invested in the firm, which is I0. And so at time 0, the firm is going to issue debt and is going to use this debt to fund the cost of the new investment. Okay. At time 1, it's going to use these revenues from the investment and its retained cash to fund I1 internally, and notice that it will have enough cash to do so. And at time 0, it's going to generate revenues R to S and repay D to investors. Now, this is possible because of this assumption that we make regarding revenues of the good firm at time 2. Okay, so what is the total wealth of shareholders? So first of all, they're going to receive this dividend payment that we have here. Second, what are they going to get? So they're going to reinvest in the assets in place. So the assets in place are going to retain their value, capital A. They are also going to get some revenues, R2S. So R1S is going to be used to fund I1, which is why we don't have it here. And finally, they are going to need to repay the amount D to investors, and D is equal to I0. And so this is a debt repayment. And how can we write this total payoff to shareholders? Well, this is the initial cash holdings, which is R, plus the NPV of assets in place, which is A minus I1, plus the NPV of the new investment, which is, so the investment cost minus investment cost plus the sum of future revenues. Okay. And so all is, well, as good as it can be, right? The shareholders fully capture the NPV of their assets in place and of future investments. And the NPV in both cases are positive. But what we're interested in is to verify that this total wealth would be larger than the one that they would get if they were to follow the same strategy as a bad firm. If that would be the case, well, they would not invest in the project. So they would just get R assets in place and they would just reinvest. And so their total wealth would be equal to this. Okay. And as you can quickly verify, because the NPV of a new investment is positive, the expression here is larger than this. Okay. So the firm is acting optimally. Now let's take the perspective of a bad firm. So a bad firm does not pay out any dividend. So this is what we postulated. Does not raise funding, does not invest. Okay, it does not raise funding, does not invest. And at time 1, it's going to use its cash to fund I1 internally. So as we just discussed in this case, what is going to be the total payoff to shareholders? Well, you get the cash, you get assets in place, you reinvest. And so what you get is simply this amount. Okay. So now we need to verify that the firm is better off getting this amount compared to what it would get if it were to imitate a good firm. Okay. So now let's assume that a bad firm is trying to mimic whatever a good firm is doing. So it is trying to pretend that it is a good firm. So at time 0, it's going to pay out the same dividend as a good firm. And so it's going to pay out this amount in blue. It's also going to raise debt D equals to, with a debt repayment of I0, and it's going to use that to cover the investment cost of I0. So here you may be wondering, so why will the debt repayment be equal to I0? Because it seems that the firm might not be able to meet its debt repayment, right? So this is not risk-free debt. And so the debt repayment, so why is it equal to I0, right? So this is a bit surprising. And here the idea is that we're trying to verify that the firm is acting optimally, conditional on the beliefs of investors. investors believe that a firm that pays a dividend worth this much is a good firm. So in this case, even though it is actually a bad firm paying out this dividend, investors will still believe that it is a good firm. Okay. And so we need to verify that even though investors have these beliefs, it would be suboptimal for the firm to deviate this way and to try to imitate a good firm. Okay. So at time one, well, the firm is pretending to be a good firm, but it's still a bad firm, right? So its revenues are R1F. There's not enough funding for reinvestment purposes, and so this is what we already derived here. Because it's paying a high dividend, the firm is running out of cash at time one. So it cannot reinvest the amount I1 in its assets in place. So the firm does not reinvest I1, and so assets must be liquidated. And so the firm is going to get lambda A instead of A. And here we're interested in what debt holders get, because shareholders are going to get whatever debt holders do not get. So the payoff of debt holders is whatever the firm produces, which is this much. And this is minimum between this and the debt repayment. Debt repayment is equal to D, and we know that D is equal to I0. So what does the firm get? So what do debt holders get? Well, there's the retained cash. So the firm did not pay out all its cash as a dividend. There's still this amount, which is retained cash. Then the firm is going to generate revenues and is going to get the liquidation value of the firm's assets. Okay, so the debt holders are going to get the minimum between this and the debt repayment that they are entitled to. So now what do shareholders get? Let's take the perspective of shareholders, because they are the ones deciding which strategies a firm should pursue. So their total wealth includes, well, the dividend that they pay to themselves at time zero. Now this is the first component here. Plus the equity payoff at the end, so at time two, which is going to be equal to, so they are protected by limited liability, right? So this is the maximum between what the firm produces minus the debt repayment to debt holders. And so the max between this and zero, because worst case scenario, they are protected by limited liabilities, they get zero. So again, so what the firm produces, so it's the same here and there. And so what I am claiming is that this whole wealth that shareholders would get if they are shareholders in a bad firm, which is imitating a good firm, so pretending to be a good firm, I am claiming that this is less than what they would get if they were to pursue the postulated strategy of a bad firm. Why is that the case? Well, there's two possibilities, right? So if the max operator here is equal to this, or if it is equal to 0. So let's start with this latter case. So if the max is equal to 0, so the only thing that we need to verify is that R1S is less than A. But this was assumed. R1S less than A, yes. There we go. All right, so now we must verify that if the max operator is strictly positive, this inequality is still satisfied. Okay, so if the max operator is positive, so we have minus I1 here, we have plus I1 there, so it's going to cancel out. Likewise, we have R1S here plus here minus R1S, so it's going to cancel out. So a few terms will drop out, and we are left just with that on the left-hand side of that inequality. But if you consider now these three terms, this is negative because of the negative NPV assumption regarding the value of the project for a bad type. This is negative. And so then we have this inequality. So now the only thing left to show is that this is less than that. But this is true because we assumed that liquidating the firm's existing assets has a negative NPV. Okay, the firm is better off reinvesting in its existing assets. And so this inequality hold, which shows that, so in any case, the total wealth of shareholders of a bad firm when they are trying to imitate a good firm is less than what they can get if they simply pursue the postulated strategy of a bad firm. Okay. So in summary, it is not optimal for shareholders in a bad firm to try to imitate a good firm. So we have verified that the postulated strategies are indeed optimal for each firms, and it is very straightforward to then verify that the beliefs of investors will indeed be verified. Okay, so let's summarize. So dividend payments matter in this model because they convey information. And so following a dividend payment, and more specifically a dividend announcement, investors are going to update their beliefs about the firm type. And the key in this model is that it was very costly for a bad type of firm to pay a dividend, because then it will run out of cash in the future, simply because it would not produce enough future revenues. Whereas a good firm could commit to paying some cash, or can even pay some cash right now without running out of funds in the future. Okay. And so this is very consistent with the fact that when a firm which is publicly listed announces a dividend payment, so its stock price is going to instantaneously increase. And this is simply because of information revelation and belief updating on the part of investors. And this works because here firm actions credibly reveal firm insiders' information. And for this to work, it must be more beneficial for some firms to take actions, and it should be sufficiently costly for other firms to take the same action. Okay. And here, so debt can be issued at very good terms by a firm with a good type, precisely because the dividend payment reveals a firm type, so that then at the time of issuing debt, there is no asymmetric information anymore. There is no adverse selection problem. And so a good firm can issue debt at very good terms. And this can explain the coincidence of payout to shareholders in the form of dividend payments and external funding at the same time. So at the same time, you're giving money back to your shareholders, but then you're getting some other money from investors, which seems a bit strange, but actually this theory can explain why you would want to do these two things simultaneously. You pay dividend payments to reveal your type, and then you raise funding at very good terms. But of course, a signal must be credible. And for that to be the case, it must be sufficiently costly for a bad type of firm to imitate a good type of firm. And so sometimes good types may take actions to distinguish themselves from bad types. So to be in a separating equilibrium, because again, there's some benefits to being in a separating equilibrium. For example, whenever you need to raise external funding, then you're going to be able to do so at very good terms, or your stock price is going to reflect your firm type, which can also be valuable for a firm. Okay, and so these actions can be costly. Sometimes they will be costly even to the good type, but as long as they are more costly to the bad type and that they credibly reveal the firm type, they can be optimal on the part of the firm. And so this is why, for example, firms are going to pay dividends, even when using share repurchases would in some cases be more efficient for tax purposes. And this is simply because firms are going to use dividend payments as a signal of their type, and this is inherently valuable. Okay, so you should read the corresponding chapter in the Tyrrell textbook. So in Tyrrell, the dividend theory is based on a moral hazard problem, which is a friction that will prevent the Modigliani-Miller irrelevance result from applying. Here we use an adverse selection model, which might be more relevant, but it's still interesting for you to read this chapter in the Tyrrell textbook. Okay, that's all for now.